Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Sword of the Halfling from Legacy Arms. And before I get into the video, one quick caveat you should know is that it is a review sample. It was sent to me for free to do this review. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. The other thing you should probably know up front is the cost. This is $255 if you like to spend more money than you need to on the CAS website. However, if you go to an authorized distributor like Cult of Athena, you can find it for around $230. So that's the frame of mind I'm going to be thinking about it in as I think of if it's worth it or not. Incidentally, this video will go over the close-ups of the bits and bobs and features. I'll talk about build quality, let you see what it looks like up close. Then I'm going to move it around, use it, abuse it a little bit, and then I'll give you my opinion on if I think it's worth it or not. But at that point, you should have some idea yourself. Anyway, that is the general plan here. I will link in the description down below measurements as well as where you can buy it if you are so inclined. Getting on with the bits and bobs section, I'm going to talk about the pommel first and just the aesthetic of the pommel, specifically the color. It reminds me of galvanized fittings at a Home Depot. It has the same kind of patina as like a bucket. It looks modern and odd. At the same time, it fits well with this functional fantasy, and I can't say that I mind it, but I can say that some people are probably not going to like it. I just don't happen to be one of them. I actually enjoy it. At first, it was a little off-putting, but then I got used to it. Up close, it has this, I don't know, kind of almost textured visual thing, but it's smooth to the touch. Anyway, it reminds me of like galvanized fittings from Home Depot, like I said. Shape-wise, though, it has some charm. So as you can see in profile here, it slims down to a round section towards the base. It flares out and is round out at the end as well, where you can make out a peen that is relatively well sanded and recessed. It's not so much after I've banged it around a little bit, I can kind of get a fingernail on it. But generally speaking, you wouldn't be able to see it or feel it too much. At least you couldn't when it was new. As it is, it feels very comfortable in the hand. There's no hot spots or anything like that. It's relatively well designed. I feel like I could take this and deliver a good thump. At the same time, there's nothing sharp jutting out that's going to poke me in the hands or give me any discomfort as a user. From a grip standpoint, I really actually don't mind it. It has some depth in terms of it flaring and also this kind of chamfered edge, this disc face out at the end. But as you can see, the wood juts into it. There's this little tongue and groove thing going on here, and the wood has a little tongue that sticks into the pommel. And since this one is now diminished, I can kind of get the pommel to wiggle a little bit. I think that wood is what's actually keeping it secure. Perhaps it's the shape of the tang, but regardless, I can't really move the pommel too much because of the nature of its construction. It's peened, but this little tongue here keeps everything also generally aligned, even if it has a little bit of wiggle. The woodworking here is also reasonably well done. It just thins out a little bit on where this section is, which is hard to do because wood grinds a little easier than metal does. Regardless, the spaces between the wood and the metal, often on blades that are, under thousands of dollars, these tolerances don't tend to be particularly clean or nice. This one was overall quite well done. There were gaps, but they weren't full of resin and schmutz and yucky bits. And while there's some gapping there, it's nothing that I would really say is problematic for a sword in this price point. As I move on to the rest of the grip, it's a simple kind of darker wood, and it has a satin type finish to it. I didn't find it slippery in a bare hand or in a glove. It fit overall quite well, and again, has a little bit of dimension. It's a little bit more ovoid towards the crossguard and reduces down to a more circular shape towards this pommel area here. It's long enough for me to hold in two hands. If I want to, I can kind of get two of them on there at the same time. It feels comfortable in one, and I can also bring my grip down here. The little flare keeps it locked into my hand in a way. I didn't have a problem indexing it. I didn't have a problem with it slipping. I did have a problem with it cracking eventually, though. I had to be pretty abusive to the sword, and I can't say that I actually noticed the cracking while I was using it. My fingers don't get snagged or caught anywhere in there, but I do see that it has cracked, and I have put the sword through some abuse at this point, so I'm not surprised, but it certainly wasn't cracked when I got it. It took doing some aggressive things, presumably, to get it to crack. I can only say somewhere along the way it did, and I'm guessing it had happened when I started using the crossguard as a percussive tool. That brings me to the crossguard area here, though, and again, we have something very stylistically Sting from Lord of the Rings. This is got this kind of lobed leaf looking, I don't exactly know how to place it, but it reminds me of Sting from Lord of the Rings, but a gentler, less ornate version of it. It has the same patina, and these quillins are reasonably sharp. I can also tell you they're reasonably durable because I took this sword and started punching a log with the quillins, It did develop a little bit of rattle, but not so much that I don't think I could fix it. It's overall reasonably well done. Transitions between the crossguard and grip are relatively well done as well, very minimal gapping, and there is a little bit of a peak that needs to be sanded into the guard in order to get it to fit on here correctly. That is hard to do, and so tip of my hat for having it done as cleanly and nicely as it is on a sword under 300 bucks. The gap in the crossguard as well is quite small. There's not a lot of gapping here, and that was a little bit of a surprise. It has a nice diamond cross section, but there's, about a millimeter around. The tolerances there are quite tight. That's a thing that I harp on. It doesn't really impact performance, but it's something I like to see. It's hard to do well, and it is done well here. Anyway, that's enough of the guard. I will say, generally speaking, the hilt has a handsome appearance to it. It looks very Lord of the Rings inspired. If that's what you're looking for, this is certainly more subtle than the props in the film, but at the same time, it brings that to mind anyway. The scabbard, if I talk about it, so important things, does it scabbard well? Well, the tension is reasonably well done. It deploys easily, but also retains it reasonably well. It doesn't rattle, at least not a whole lot. And it has a very stylistic look here, which I really enjoy. It has these metal throat and chape down at the end, and they're just different than things that I have seen before. So from that side of things, I like it. There is a seam in the leather. The leather on the scabbard feels good in the sense that I can't displace it particularly easily. It feels pleasant to the hand anyway. These metal fittings, though, have little ridges on them, so little places that can catch, and especially these little curly bits right here, I can kind of bend them out if I want and bend them back in, but they catch on my belt more or less. Anytime that this chape has these little hooks on the end, I'm just waiting for disaster to strike. They can catch on things as I'm walking around, and so I don't really like that. I would imagine this could be pressed in or fit better or glued down, or something could be done to secure it in a way that would be sufficient, but I'm not particularly handy that way, and it makes me nervous to do it. So I would say that's an opportunity, or just something that I don't like. At the same time, this is a short sword, so it doesn't stick out behind you as much as a longer sword might. It's less consequential to have these little hooks on there if it's not dragging behind you, but these hooks on the end of a chape have been problematic because if I walk around in Renfest garb, inevitably I'm going to catch on a tablecloth and pull something down behind me because there's a hook behind me waiting to grab onto things that I'm not paying attention to. And I don't walk around in a sword sticking out behind me, at least not long swords, very often, so I tend to be, I don't know, just unaware of that little hook waiting to grab onto stuff behind me. And this would be a very problematic one were it longer. It's not, but still makes me nervous if I actually wore it around. As it is, though, it has an interesting look and generally does scabbard things well. Now I'm going to move on to the blade, the pointy stabby part, and there's a little bit to unpack here. This is a leaf-shaped blade, very reminiscent of Sting from Lord of the Rings. It starts off pretty thick right at the crossguard, narrows down about 2 inches above that crossguard area, and then swells out to this larger cutting belly and goes back to an acute point that's still pretty thick. There is some distal taper here, but not a lot, not as much as there could be, though for a short sword you don't really need one to have it move around. This is not light necessarily in the hand, but given its size, it has kind of an intrinsic feeling of connection just because it's a shorter sword. It's not as problematic to move as a longer one would be, even if it were the same weight. I digress. The blade itself is nice looking. Measurements are in the description down below. It has a strong diamond cross section that stays pretty consistent. It doesn't waver around. I do make out ripples in the surface, and it has a look. It has a look that is sufficient. It's supposed to be made of 5160 steel. I say supposed to be because I have no way of validating it. It seems sufficient for the task of doing sword-like things. It's a tried and true steel that has done the job time and time again. I would say that my two concerns with the blade are, one, it has a relatively obtuse edge angle on it, and that means that it cuts, and I can tell you from cutting, it did a sufficient job. I was actually surprised at how effective a cutter it was. But in order for me to refine this and make this a better cutting sword, it would be a little bit of work to trim down this edge angle and get it a little bit more refined than it is. Not too much work, very doable, but at the same time, the edge angle is a little obtuse, and that would be somewhat problematic for me to sharpen and get really refined. So that's one thing you should know. As it is, though, I did cut with it, and it held up reasonably well, and the edge did a serviceable job cutting, at least what I was cutting. The other thing that I would say, though, is that the steel is tempered between 50 and 55 HRC, at least with the accuracy I can get from my files, and that seems fine for longer swords, but a missed opportunity for a shorter one. I didn't really notice too much of a problem, but when I was thrusting in with the tip and I did some bending and whatnot, the tip would bend. Thrusting it into a log and trying to bend the tip, I was able to get the tip to bend. And other swords, or harder ones, I guess I should say, it's been a little bit more resistant to bending than this one is. It's on the softer side, not insufficient for a sword, not necessarily not up to the task, but could be a little harder than it is, at least in my estimation. Shorter swords are less susceptible to some of the bouncing and well, the shock resistance required for longer blades isn't required on some of these shorter ones, so could be a little harder. I guess just an opportunity for the future. As it is, it's perfectly fine. It is very functional, and I suppose that brings me to the cutting side of things. So I will dispense with doing forms or moving it around because it's a fantasy functional sword. I don't know that there, I don't know any if there are. I don't really want to try if there are. But I did use it to cut water bottles. I cut frozen water bottles as well. The sword held up in a way that I would say is overall quite good. I didn't notice any chipping, bending, diminishing, and it wasn't until I went into abusive stuff that I really noticed any issue. I noticed some wiggle in the crossguard when I started punching a log with the kind of pointy bits of the crossguard. It held up overall well, but I do have a little bit of wiggle in the pommel, a little bit of cracking in the handle, a little bit of wiggle in the crossguard, not a lot. The blade would bend if I stuck it into a log and, kind of deeply about 1 inch and then bent at the tip. I could get it to bend, but I could also get it to bend back and it's straight now. And overall, it held up well. I was chopping ice blocks with it. I was chopping water bottles. I chopped into wood repeatedly, and it's still in one piece. I also think that the condition that it is in could be remedied with a little bit of glue, a clamp. I think I could actually make this as good or better than it was before, and especially if I put a little bit of time into sharpening it and refining the edge angle, I think it would actually be a pretty solid little cutter. I was actually impressed with how fun it was to move around, how the reach wasn't weird for me. I don't use swords of this size very often, but I didn't really have much trouble. It looked a little better in my son's hands, incidentally. If I plopped him with it, he's shorter than I am, so it seemed to fit him like a sword. And so maybe I will dull it completely and let him play with it and take the tip off or something like that. He's a little shorter. I thought it looked like a fun prop for him, but I don't necessarily advocate giving your 4-year-olds sharp toys to play with. I digress. It held up well. It cut well. It was actually surprisingly good. I think with some tinkering, you could make it better than it is today. And while it did diminish its condition, all of those are things that I think are acceptable for the kind of punishment that I gave it. It'd be nice if it held up better, but I wouldn't expect it for the money, and I think I could fix them myself if I wanted to. All right, sword friends, you've seen close-ups of the bits and bobs and fits and features. You've seen me throw some dumb at the sword. Hopefully at this point you know if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. It's time I answered that question then myself. Do I personally think it's worth the $230 asking price? Short answer is yes, but more complex, there's a little bit of yes and no. And I'll start with the positive. If you are a person looking for functional fantasy and you really have an emphasis on the functional, I think this does a solid job. All the parts of the sword held up well, at least as much as you could expect for what I did to them, and they all did sword-like things quite well. It's not the least expensive amount of money. You could find a more screen-accurate one. You could find something that maybe looked the part a little bit more if you were leaning towards Lord of the Rings or just fantasy. But if you want something that is a healthy mixture of the two, and again, you want it to hold up well, I do think what you get here is overall quite good and worth the money. To the no side, though, and where I would give a little bit more consideration. One, if you're just looking for any old sword, and it doesn't have to be a Lord of the Rings-inspired functional fantasy sword, I think your $230 could go further, even in the Legacy Arms catalog, than this one does here. It's a smaller batch of items, and so you're probably paying a little bit more for it. It's cool if that's what you're looking for, but if it's not, your money could get probably close to a longsword or a katana or some other kind of sword if you didn't care what you were getting. Likewise, if you wanted a screen-accurate replica, that's not what this is. It's probably much more functional than a screen-accurate replica, but you could certainly find something like that that's more of a wall hanger if that's what you're after. So it does have to be a balance of wanting something that is functional fantasy or Lord of the Rings inspired, and if you want those things, I do think you get it. If you're not die-hard on those things, though, I think your dollar can stretch a little further elsewhere. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's been helpful. I want to thank again the folks at Cast Iberia for sending this my way for review. Cheers, and thanks for watching.